A tragedy in the name of honor and glory. How far would you go to achieve that? I did read all these books about the original USS Intrepid, but I didn't take notes, so at the risk of sounding dumb, here we go. Quick recap about the USS Intrepid. It was originally a Tripolitan ketch, which is a fishing boat. Stephen Decatur captured it and used it to burn the USS Philadelphia. When that was done, it became a forgotten neglected vessel. Season was winding down and summer was turning to fall. Commodore Edward Preble received news that Commodore Samuel Barron was on his way with a larger squadron and would outrank him. By the news, acting Captain Isaac Chauncey, who was on the John Adams. Commodore Edward Preble knew that he was losing time to bring Bashaw Yusuf Karlimanli to the bargaining table to free the prisoners of the USS Philadelphia. As a Hail Mary, Commodore Edward Preble decided to use the idea of Captain William Bainbridge, who was formerly of the USS Philadelphia. Within these letters that William Bainbridge sent to Edward Preble, Bainbridge used invisible ink writing in between the lines, talking about intelligence of the fortress, the batteries, the harbor of Tripoli. He suggested that a fire ship be sent into the harbor and explode the surrounding area. This idea started to become more intriguing towards Preble because despite all the bombardment he and his squadron was doing to the castle and the batteries, it was more like a spectacle. There wasn't really any real impact. And so Edward Preble, he needed something big. He needed, like I said, to bring Bashaw Karlimanli to the bargaining table because it was just all show at this point. Of course, knowing how dangerous his mission was, Edward Preble needed volunteers, and surprisingly, all the men in the squadron volunteered for this because this was a chance to show their valor, to create a name for themselves. It was all for glory. And a very important name was Stephen Decatur. He volunteered to lead the whole expedition, but Edward Preble decided to hand the leadership role over to Stephen Decatur's friend Richard Somers, who was born in Egg Harbor City, New Jersey in 1778. And Richard Somers and Stephen Decatur were childhood best friends. And so Stephen Decatur, he wasn't really heard about the fact that this opportunity was handed over to someone that he really cared about because, like I said, this was all about creating a name for themselves, creating all for glory. And so Stephen Decatur, he already won his fame and glory burning the USS Philadelphia. And so his friend receiving an opportunity to do the same, to reach that same height, he was all for it. Richard Somers knew how dangerous this mission was, and so it was a very solemn moment when he gave Stephen Decatur his most prized possession, which was a golden ring. Richard Somers must have known that he was never going to come back from this. Midshipman Charles Ridgely of the Nautilus, which was Richard Somers' ship, he talks about the oral wills that the other volunteers who were selected to the Intrepid made. I say, Sam Jones, I leave you my blue jacket and duck trousers stowed away in my bag. And Bill Curtis, you may have the tarpaulin hat and girthsy frock and them petticoat trousers I got in Malta. And mind, boys, when you get home, give a good account of us. As one of the few officers left on a Nautilus, Ridgely said the duty of carrying out those last-minute instructions fell to him. He carried them out to the very letter. I'm just going to read the rest of this, okay? Without a pilot and using only the stars to guide him, Somers steered the Intrepid into the inner harbor at 9 p.m. Overhead Polaris guided Somers as he slowly headed east by south into the harbor. The constellation Draco, the dragon, hung over the city, giving the Intrepid a perfect aiming point as the ketch approached the anchored pirate fleet. Master Commandant Charles Stewart, who was another childhood friend of Richard Somers, stood near the helm of the brig Siren, peering into the darkness. Like every other officer and man in the squadron, Stewart tried his best to catch a glimpse of the Intrepid. By 9:45 p.m., Stewart had nearly lost sight of the ketch as she closed in on the Tripolitan force. 1 minute later, Midshipman Michael B. Carroll, standing next to Stewart on the Siren, shouted, "I see a light!" and pointed towards the ketch. The officer said the light looked like a lantern being carried by some person in quick motion along a vessel's deck. And at 9:47 p.m., a thunderous explosion shook the Tripoli harbor. For a moment, the flash illuminated the whole heavens around, while the terrific concussion shook everything far and near, Ridgely said. Then all was hushed again, and every object veiled in the darkness of double gloom. The minute-long explosion filled the harbor with sparks, and as the shells of the Intrepid launched crazily, the blast lit up the Intrepid for a split second, and some sailors reported seeing her mast twisting in the air. All around the squadron, officers and sailors alike raced to watch the spectacle. Although they had no idea what had happened, they all knew the Intrepid exploded far too early. "How awfully grand," wrote Midshipman Robert T. Spence, who was on the USS Constitution. Everything wrapped in dead silence made the explosion loud and terrible. The fuses of the shells, burning in the air, shone like so many planets. A vast stream of fire, which appeared ascending to heaven, portrayed the walls of our view. At 10 p.m., Preble ordered the Constitution to fire guns and rockets every 10 minutes as a beacon for Somers and his companions. The Commodore was making repeated signals for Captain Somers, which was not answered, says a midshipman's journal. Midnight. The Commodore is still making signals without being answered. On the 6th of September, the Pasha allowed William Bainbridge and Lieutenant David Porter to leave their prison and go down to the beach to examine some of the bodies that had been recovered after the explosion. In his journal, Bainbridge reported, "There were 6 persons in the most mangled and burnt condition lying on the shore, whom we suppose to have been part of the unfortunate crew of the fire vessel, the bottom of which grounded on the north side of the rocks near the round battery. 2 of these distressed-looking objects were fished out of the wreck. From the whole of them being so much disfigured, it was impossible to recognize any known features to us, or even distinguish an officer from a seaman. Who accompanied us informed me that he saw 6 others yesterday on the shore to the southward, which were supposed to have come from the same vessel." Edward's campaign was over. There's a lot of speculation of why the USS Intrepid exploded prematurely. Midshipman William Allen took a huge interest in this, and he drew a draft of the ship, sent a copy to his father with all the details about the amount of barrels of gunpowder, the shots, the position of everything, where the gunpowder and shots were placed, the direction of the harbor, the wind, and everything, all these different details. And how the ship, the Intrepid, was sailing into the harbor. If the wind was coming from a specific direction, then where the gunpowder and the explosives were positioned were placed, then what direction the explosion, the bomb, would burst into. William Allen came to the same conclusion as Edward Preble when Edward Preble claimed that Richard Somers told him that if anything were to happen, if he was to be discovered before he had the chance to be in the correct position or location of the harbor, then Richard Somers will put a match to the gunpowder himself and explode everybody on board to avoid the risk of being captured. When Lieutenant David Porter and the rest of the crew of the USS Philadelphia finally got released, thanks to Captain William Eaton's efforts in the shore to Tripoli, the Battle of Derna, David Porter, he was promoted to Master Commandant, and to honor his friend, Henry Wadsworth, who would be the uncle of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, David Porter went around and collected funds from his fellow captains, seamen, and all that stuff, and all those other people, to create a monument that is the Tripoli Monument, and can be found in Annapolis, Maryland. Tripoli Monument was dedicated to Master Commandant Richard Somers, Lieutenants James Cadwell, James Decatur, Henry Wadsworth, Joseph Israel, and John Dorsey. The monument arrived in Boston during the autumn of 1807 and eventually carried to Washington. But when it was in Washington during the War of 1812, it got vandalized by the British troops, and so it was transported to Annapolis, Maryland.